The film's money journey began in paradox, a story about repetition, lived once through an experience that felt like reliving everything. Plans redrawn, schedules reset, entire sequences reimagined with the precision of déjà vu, making it was not unlike the world it portrayed, where time bends but cost never stops. The rhythm of its creation pulsed between control and surrender, a cycle of rebuilding that demanded faith as much as funding. Those who carried it forward understood that every loop in production was a new negotiation between vision and reality. Each reset paid for twice, once in money, once in endurance. At the start, confidence and risk sat across the same table. The premise was large, the world complex, the demands endless. Science fiction always arrives carrying the weight of both imagination and expense. To make this world believable required precision, design that felt tactile, spectacle that felt lived in, chaos engineered frame by frame. The money followed that logic, structured for intensity, released in waves, tied to milestones that mirrored the narrative's loops. Every department learned to measure ambition against repetition, to find economy inside spectacle. The film's early atmosphere was electric but cautious. Everyone understood its scale, massive but not indulgent. The script's demands meant that every detail would multiply. Props cloned for resets, sets rebuilt for scenes replayed from new angles, timelines stacked like mirrors. Each creative decision carried a hidden financial twin. When a day repeated on screen, it repeated in production. Costumes cleaned, surfaces reset, background patterns remade. The irony was that a story about infinite time required real-world patience, and patience costs. The team learned to treat exhaustion as currency, resilience as investment. The financial motion of the film was circular. Unlike straightforward productions where budgets descend toward completion, this one oscillated, fluctuating with its narrative rhythm. It expanded for design and shrank for repetition, stretched for spectacle, then folded back into discipline. Every phase carried the sense of returning to the beginning. Crew members joked that they, too, were living the story. Each morning felt like the same morning, each scene like a familiar negotiation reborn. The repetition tested morale, but it also sharpened skill. Efficiency became art. In that repetition, a strange clarity emerged. The film's money began to mirror its meaning. Every reset brought refinement. What once took hours was achieved in half the time. Waste disappeared. Teams learned to operate in rhythm, not reaction. The project began as a storm of ambition and settled into a choreography of endurance. The producers noticed this evolution in their ledgers as much as in their dailies, the gradual tightening of flow, the synchronization of departments. The cost of time remained high, but its value deepened. There were moments when the repetition turned personal. Actors, editors, technicians, each lived their own loop. A line rehearsed again, a sequence relit, a set rebuilt. The production no longer felt linear. It felt recursive, as though creation itself were caught between déjà vu and discovery. Financially, this demanded precision. No one could afford a drift. Repetition, if uncontrolled, meant duplication. Duplication meant waste. The accounting became as meticulous as choreography, matching rhythm to necessity. Behind the controlled structure, emotion simmered. The film's tone, its tension between futility and persistence, seeped into the atmosphere of its making. The people funding it could sense the strain, but also the clarity forming inside it. The film's cost was not extravagance. It was endurance paid in increments. Each obstacle taught agility, each overrun brought learning that refined the next loop. The team began to speak of progress, not in numbers, but in adaptation. Money had become motion, never idle, always recalculating. The physical experience of making the film felt vast. Sets rose and vanished like waves. Crews rebuilt battlefields across open landscapes, rehearsing motion until chaos looked effortless. Vehicles, armor, explosions, all timed to the rhythm of repetition. The scale was staggering but tightly governed. There was no indulgence, only exactness. The money existed to make realism out of impossibility. What audiences would later see as fluid action was, in truth, the product of hundreds of micro-calibrations, each one its own financial decision. In this rhythm, human fatigue intertwined with achievement. Everyone on set understood that precision carries its own exhaustion. The repetition that refined the film also wore people down. The cast learned to embody exhaustion. The crew lived it. Yet that weariness translated into authenticity. What was felt behind the camera bled naturally onto the screen. The cost of emotion became indistinguishable from the cost of production. For the financiers, the film's journey was a case study in adaptation. Early optimism was tempered by logistics, but confidence never vanished. Each new schedule brought recalculation, but also reassurance. They had backed a concept rooted in risk, and risk, when handled with control, can generate clarity. The film's financial arc reflected its story's moral: mastery through repetition, progress through persistence. When production finally broke its own loop and entered post, the shift felt seismic. Time, once infinite, became linear again. Editing became an act of liberation, assembling the many versions of the same moment into something whole. For the accountants, the same was true. Budgets that had folded and unfolded for months finally settled into sequence. The rhythm of spending slowed, and relief began to surface. The film had survived itself. What appeared on screen in the end was not simply spectacle, but endurance made visible. The money, the hours, the recalculations, all had vanished into the illusion of effortlessness. The film felt fast, light, immediate, but behind that speed lived months of precision. The team could see their reflection in every loop, the endless repetition that had turned chaos into rhythm. When it reached audiences, the reaction mirrored the film's creation. People returned to it, rewatched it, spoke of its loops as if living inside them. Success did not explode, it circulated. The box office pattern resembled the film's theme, a steady rise built on momentum, a journey of repetition rewarded through persistence. Those who had financed and made it recognized that pattern instantly. They had lived it line by line, frame by frame. In the quiet after its release, reflection replaced urgency. The film's financial record read like a log of evolution. Cautious beginnings, disciplined expansion, gradual stabilization, eventual calm. It proved something everyone had suspected but rarely witnessed so clearly: that patience, measured correctly, can yield precision more valuable than extravagance. The people who had built this loop learned that endurance, when respected, turns into mastery. What endured most, beyond success or scale, was the symmetry between meaning and method. A story about repeating days had been made by people repeating days. A film about persistence had been sustained by persistence. Every dollar had followed that rhythm, circling until it settled into understanding. The money had become a mirror of the message. Time, spent wisely, always returns as clarity. The film's scale felt like gravity, vast but invisible, pulling everything inward toward discipline. On paper, it was immense. War zones reconstructed across continents, technology designed to look battered and human, machinery choreographed to behave like thought. Yet on set, that magnitude felt contained, purposeful. Every decision was filtered through the question that shaped the film's world itself. What is essential to survival? That question defined its production as much as its story. The ambition was cinematic, but the method was surgical. The budget structure did not balloon outward. It folded inward, focusing on control. The story demanded repetition, which meant that scale could not rely on quantity, but on variation. Sets were built not to impress, but to transform. Battlefields that could collapse and resurrect. Interiors that could shift with minimal rebuilds. Environments that lived multiple lives under different lighting, weather, and framing. This was where the film's money truly lived, in adaptability. The first thing anyone noticed about the production was rhythm. Unlike most large-scale projects that move in sprawling arcs, this one moved in loops. Each day on set resembled the one before, but with slight changes, different angles, reimagined performances, adjusted timing. The repetition was hypnotic. Crew members learned to anticipate motion. To prepare for déjà vu, cameras retraced steps like muscle memory. The design of the production mirrored the design of its narrative. This circular scale required precision beyond size. Every repetition had to feel fresh while being exact. That control came at a cost measured in endurance rather than money. Departments adapted like organisms in an ecosystem. Costume and props lived in cycles. Reset, repair, reuse. Art direction had to make continuity feel like change, ensuring that repeated days reflected progression without distortion. The financial architecture supporting this rhythm evolved accordingly. Funds were distributed not across spectacle, but across repetition, reallocations for set resets, maintenance, labor extensions. What might have looked like redundancy from outside was, in truth, calibration. The repetition turned waste into method. The energy of the set carried that same balance. It was a paradoxical mix of fatigue and precision, of scale contained by control. The crew's movements became synchronized, reflexive. Communication shortened to signals, glances, shorthand. They were not just filming. They were performing a routine that demanded perfection inside exhaustion. The work's repetition blurred boundaries between artistry and endurance, between fatigue and focus. The budget scale reflected that blur. It was vast enough to sustain the loop, but tight enough to demand coherence. In the early stages, the production's biggest challenge was physics, the weight of repetition itself. Resetting massive environments multiple times a day required meticulous coordination. Vehicles, dust, lighting, weather, all needed to reset perfectly so that the illusion of continuity held. Each misalignment carried financial gravity. Precision saved hours, and hours were the real currency. The team learned that money in filmmaking is often measured not in spending, but in time preserved. The production's internal mantra became reset fast, move forward. That phrase defined everything. The large-scale battle scenes, though spectacular on screen, were controlled through repetition and efficiency. Every explosion, every movement of armor or machinery was mapped, recorded, refined, and replayed. The illusion of chaos came from 1,000 moments of control. The camera operators and effects teams learned to choreograph destruction the way dancers choreograph motion. Timed, precise, mathematical. The grandeur of it was technical, not indulgent. The film's realism grew directly from this tension between magnitude and management. The visual style emerged from necessity. The story's looping structure meant that the camera had to carry memory. It could not merely observe. To achieve that, the director and cinematographer built continuity into the production's visual logic. Repeated moments were shot with small differences in composition, turning familiarity into narrative. The lighting design followed a similar discipline. No large lighting rigs to overwhelm. Instead, modular setups that could transform spaces quickly. Every element of the film scale served flexibility first. Morale, as on any large-scale production, oscillated. Some days felt infinite, endless loops of motion and noise. Others ended in rare stillness, when a repetition clicked and something intangible appeared on screen. The exhaustion became collective, but so did pride. Crew members spoke of the strange satisfaction and precision, the joy of executing something perfectly after trying it 100 times. The scale of the film became emotional rather than spatial. People realized they were part of an experiment in patience. Early creative choices determined this entire structure. From the beginning, the director had insisted that the film's spectacle should serve clarity, not confusion. That meant restraint within magnitude. The production's financial model reflected that ideal. Instead of overspending on elaborate singular moments, money was poured into systems. Motion rigs, reprogrammable sets, effects pipelines that could reproduce variation at speed. The investment was in process, not display. When the film reached its full stride, those systems began to pay for themselves. Efficiency replaced extravagance. During post-production, that same discipline carried over. Editing mirrored shooting, loops refined, patterns studied. The team realized that their months of repetition had created footage with hidden precision. Shots that felt redundant during filming now connected with mathematical harmony. The scale of the film was no longer about size, but about detail, the density of small accuracies layered together until they became something monumental. Looking back, those who worked on it could see how its structure had shaped its soul. The film had no wasted frame, no ornamental excess. Its size was its restraint, its expense its discipline. The scope of the production had been an exercise in control, a study in how vastness can exist quietly. The scale that audiences would later feel as immersive intensity was, in truth, the result of countless repetitions done with the patience of craft. In retrospect, the film's financial and creative scale stood as proof that ambition does not always mean expansion. Sometimes it means refinement. The project's magnitude had been contained within its design, its chaos engineered into elegance. For the people who built it, that was the real triumph. They had turned scale into structure, motion into method, repetition into revelation. The film's world may have depicted endless time, but its making proved something rarer. That precision, when sustained across magnitude, becomes its own form of grace. The rhythm of support for the film began long before cameras rolled, and it moved with an energy both confident and cautious. Everyone involved understood that it would be a story of risk told on the scale of spectacle, and that risk carried a price that could not be measured simply in numbers. The financing unfolded as a sequence of small assurances, each one building faith not in abundance, but in control. The early backers believed in the clarity of the concept, in the tension between repetition and transformation. The first meetings were filled with talk of rhythm rather than reach. The film needed to breathe. Its story was about time looping, and so its support would need to loop too. Money released in stages, each stage tied to proof of progress, each phase refining the next. The early commitments came from those who had learned to see potential in complexity. They understood that a film like this could not move in straight lines. Its financing, like its story, would bend back on itself, adjusting to discoveries along the way. During pre-production, the money moved in gentle pulses, not floods. The team needed to build confidence quietly. There were no grand gestures, only carefully timed approvals, like breathing through precision. Each allocation represented trust placed under conditions of constant change. The producers learned quickly that timing was their true instrument. Every delay meant recalibration, every green light an affirmation of balance. Financing became choreography, a dance between anticipation and assurance. As locations were confirmed and designs approved, the flow began to stabilize. The financiers, watching from a distance, could feel momentum building, but they were careful not to let momentum turn into acceleration. They had learned from other productions that speed can destroy rhythm. Instead, they adopted the patience of their own narrative. They allowed the film to gather itself. The money's journey was like a tide, rising and receding in careful intervals. What made this rhythm unique was the precision of its trust. The early funders had placed their faith not in spectacle, but in method. They knew the director's history of control, the producer's discipline, the actor's reliability. The film's tone, its insistence on repetition as structure, became the metaphor for its financing. Each investment folded into another. Each risk, once taken, was reevaluated through results. That constant return to verification gave the process its steadiness. The financiers learned to view the production not as gamble, but as calibration. When shooting began, the rhythm of support became intertwined with the rhythm of work. Money arrived in alignment with motion, distributed exactly as needed. The team on the ground operated with remarkable discipline, ensuring that progress could always be seen. The financiers, receiving updates, recognized in those reports a pattern they understood: methodical progression, quiet efficiency. There were no shocks, no spikes, no gaps. The film's internal rhythm had synchronized with its financial one. This harmony did not eliminate tension, it refined it. Production, especially of this scale, always carries friction, weather, coordination, fatigue. Each of these required financial agility. A rainstorm could shift an entire week's logistics, but the structure allowed for movement. Funds were flexible without being uncontrolled. Adjustments became acts of intelligence rather than desperation. When issues arose, solutions followed, not through panic but rhythm. The team had built a system resilient enough to bend without breaking. As filming deepened, everyone involved began to sense the emotional arc of the financing itself. The money had ceased to feel abstract. It had become part of the living process. The crew could feel its presence in the consistency of resources, the absence of scarcity. The financiers, in turn, could see their trust materialized in order. This mutual recognition, the exchange between discipline and faith, created an atmosphere of calm even within intensity. The financing was not separate from the art. It was its pulse. In the middle of production, when repetition reached its height, when days and scenes began to blend into cycles, the financial rhythm mirrored that exhaustion. Support continued like breath, unseen but vital. There were moments when the team felt they were chasing time, when the repetition became existential, when each day looked like the last. But even then, the money's movement stayed constant. Its reliability became emotional reinforcement. Everyone learned that stability can inspire as deeply as ambition. By the time production neared completion, the rhythm had achieved maturity. The financiers no longer asked for reassurance. They could see proof in motion. The film had transitioned from idea to artifact, from promise to presence. The funding, once theoretical, now existed in the shape of sets, sound, performance, and captured light. Every dollar spent could be traced to a choice that mattered. The system had completed its circle. Faith turned into evidence, evidence into trust, trust into completion. The post-production phase brought a different kind of patience. Money still moved, but slower now, concentrated in precision, visual effects, editing, sound. This was where the last reserves of faith were tested. Deadlines compressed, expectations sharpened. Yet the financing rhythm never faltered. The flow was steady, proportional. The financiers, now deeply attuned to the film's pace, understood that pressure at this stage was creative, not structural. They had built a foundation strong enough to bear delay without fear. When the final versions were approved and the accounts balanced, what remained was the same feeling that the story itself captured: release through repetition. The financiers and producers looked back and saw that they had lived the film's metaphor in real time. Each stage had been a loop: planning, execution, verification, renewal. And just like the character within the story, they had learned mastery through cycles. The money had moved not as an explosion, but as a rhythm sustained until understanding replaced effort. In the end, the film's financing felt less like a transaction and more like an evolution. It had begun as risk and ended as rhythm, as if money itself had learned to breathe with the story. Those who guided it understood that this was the quiet secret of great filmmaking, that the way resources flow can shape not just what is made, but how it feels. Here, the flow had been perfect. Time and trust had traded places until both became the same thing: a steady, enduring motion that carried everyone safely through the loop and out the other side. Ambition in this film lived within a paradox: to make repetition feel new, to build enormity from precision, to let scale serve intimacy. From the very beginning, everyone involved understood that the challenge was not in size, but in control. It was a story built on return, a man dying and rising again through the same day, and that structure demanded a production both vast and exact. Every creative decision had to answer a single question: how can the impossible feel real? The answer lay in restraint disguised as motion. The first creative conversations established the logic that would guide everything. The film must move like a loop, and its making must reflect that same rhythm. That meant no indulgence, no waste, no spectacle for its own sake. Every visual, every sound, every gesture needed to carry the weight of recognition and renewal. To achieve this, the team chose a form of creative discipline that bordered on ritual. The camera would not simply record, it would remember. The editing would not just move, it would evolve. The production design would rebuild again and again, until familiarity itself became beauty. At its most ambitious, the film attempted something few large-scale productions dare: emotional intimacy inside mechanical repetition. The story's chaos, the war, the armor, the destruction, had to coexist with precision. This duality shaped its budget logic. At its most ambitious, the film attempted something few large-scale productions dare: emotional intimacy inside mechanical repetition. The story's chaos, the war, the armor, the destruction, had to coexist with precision. This duality shaped its budget logic. Instead of expanding outward with each new sequence, the production folded inward, investing in systems that could sustain flexibility. The design teams created modular environments that could transform subtly between takes. The sets were engineered not for extravagance, but for evolution. The spectacle on screen was the product of repetition done with clarity, not abundance. The tension between ambition and constraint defined every department. The visual effects teams were asked to achieve magnitude without excess. They created layers of destruction that could be replayed and slightly altered, not multiplied. The costume department built exosuits heavy enough to look real, yet light enough to survive dozens of takes. The actors learned to move inside these designs as though fighting both gravity and fate. Every repeated motion carried emotional and physical cost, just as every repetition in the narrative carried meaning. The creative scope reached its sharpest edge in the choreography of movement. Each loop had to feel like the same day, yet reveal a different truth. The director treated time as architecture, stacking layers of perspective. Scenes that appeared identical were filmed from different emotional vantage points. The financial structure supported this through meticulous scheduling. Same sets, same gear, same light, but with shifts in rhythm and tone. It was an economy of motion that created an illusion of infinity. The more precise they became, the larger the world appeared. For the actors, especially those carrying the film's weight, the repetition was both performance and endurance. They had to convey transformation within sameness, to change without changing, to grow while standing still. That demand shaped morale. Fatigue became part of expression, and frustration became authenticity. The production's emotional atmosphere mirrored the narrative. Every day felt like the same battle fought differently. Yet in that grind, unity emerged. The cast and crew began to move as a single organism, repeating, refining, improving. What the film demanded of its characters, it demanded of its makers. Perseverance until clarity appeared. Creative decisions about tone also reflected the film's financial rhythm. The story's blend of science fiction and combat could have slipped into chaos, but the director insisted on realism within fantasy. That required grounded design and limited extravagance. The spectacle needed weight. Every explosion, every shot of machinery, had to feel tactile, something the audience could almost reach. To achieve that, practical effects were prioritized over digital. Money was spent on real construction, real fire, real contact. It was an old-fashioned approach applied to a futuristic narrative, and it gave the film its gravity. The team's creative logic often turned constraint into poetry. When schedules tightened and resets became punishing, those limits shaped invention. Scenes were cut down to their purest form, action sharpened, dialogue stripped. What remained was rhythm, clean, human, relentless. The film's clarity came not from what was added, but from what was removed. In the editing suite, this philosophy crystallized. Hours of footage condensed into motion that felt inevitable, like a dream that repeats with purpose. The film's ambition had refined itself into pulse. Even sound design carried that logic. Each explosion, each reload, Each fall was designed not just for impact, but for memory. The world needed to sound familiar without becoming noise. Repetition became musical. The looping rhythm of events gained texture through variation. The soundtrack worked like heartbeat and echo combined, reinforcing the sensation that time itself was both trap and teacher. The financial investment in audio was as deliberate as in visuals, targeted, layered, never indulgent. In the creative balance between imagination and practicality, every decision carried dual purpose. The grandest moments, the battlefield storms, the collisions of metal and will, were designed with the same care as the quietest ones. A breath, a reflection, a look. Scale and silence shared the same budget. That equality of attention made the film feel consistent, whole. The grandeur was not visual excess, but emotional precision. The creative scope had found its truth to make something massive feel personal. Throughout production, a quiet awareness grew among the team. They were making a film about learning through failure, and that theme echoed in their process. Shots missed, resets repeated, takes refined. Each cycle felt like instruction. The creative crew began to joke that the film was teaching them its philosophy: repeat until right. The exhaustion of that process became a kind of enlightenment. They realized that repetition was not punishment, but practice. The movie was training them to see creation as iteration, not perfection. When filming finally ended, the set felt both relieved and nostalgic. The repetition that had once felt endless now seemed sacred. The crew had lived the film's moral: each failure a step toward mastery, each reset a lesson in endurance. In post-production, this awareness carried into every cut. The editors, sound designers, and colorists treated the work like memory reconstruction, clarity emerging from layers. The creative choices, always tethered to restraint, gave the finished film an aura of inevitability. It looked like something that could only have been made this way. Looking back, everyone understood that the film's greatest creative act was its self-discipline. It had asked for spectacle, but rewarded precision. It had been built on repetition, but delivered transformation. The production scope was massive, but its soul was minimalist. Every element, the performance, design, music, pacing, served the same truth: control gives meaning to chaos. The creative constraint had not limited expression, it had purified it. In the end, the film stood as proof that repetition, when met with intelligence, becomes revelation. The creative scope had turned ambition into understanding. Those who lived through it carried that lesson forward. The knowledge that greatness in storytelling, as in life, lies not in constant expansion, but in the patience to repeat until the truth finally appears. Awareness began before the first images were shown to anyone, forming quietly in the corridors of conversation. The story itself carried a recognizable pull: war, repetition, reinvention, and the studio knew that its best strategy was not shock but rhythm. The campaign was designed to unfold like the film's own heartbeat: measured, deliberate, recursive. Everything about the awareness mirrored the narrative, small fragments of the same moment, repeated with variation until the pattern became irresistible. The first signals were sparse: a single image, an emblem, a tagline that carried the weight of both exhaustion and defiance. It didn't try to explain the film. It simply evoked its cycle. The marketing language spoke less in slogans and more in suggestion. Phrases like live, die, and repeat became not only a description of the story, but an invitation to participate in its rhythm. Those three words, repeated across posters and trailers, began to pulse through the culture before the film even arrived. The awareness was not built, it accumulated. The campaign's early focus was texture. The visual design favored metal, grit, movement blurred by repetition. The posters did not display grandeur. They captured exhaustion. Faces streaked with dirt, machinery glinting under overcast light, soldiers frozen mid-motion as if caught in the loop itself. This aesthetic precision was intentional. The awareness had to feel tactile, like something audiences could inhabit. Even the typography followed the rhythm of the film, bold, symmetrical, deliberate, echoing the mechanical persistence of its world. When the first teaser dropped, it moved like memory. The cuts repeated, shots returning from slightly altered angles, dialogue fragments looping against percussion that sounded like machinery breathing. The editing mirrored the story's design. Viewers didn't just see a trailer. They experienced the sensation of living the same moment again. This recursive style distinguished the film immediately. The awareness campaign had found its voice, and that voice carried the cadence of inevitability. Inside the marketing team, timing became their compass. The campaign wasn't released in waves of noise, but in cycles of recognition. Each new material echoed the last, adding only enough difference to renew curiosity. The rhythm of release created its own suspense. The public began to sense a pattern and started waiting for the next variation. Anticipation became participatory. People weren't simply watching a campaign, they were decoding it. As the release neared, the campaign widened its circle, but never lost restraint. The trailers lengthened, revealing fragments of emotion beneath the machinery. A flash of intimacy, a repetition of death, a fleeting sense of humor amid chaos. These moments softened the precision of the earlier messages, creating depth without breaking tone. The balance between realism and rhythm was delicate but perfect. Every piece of marketing felt like a continuation of the same breath. For the actors and filmmakers, the awareness stage carried its own strange familiarity. They saw their work repeated endlessly in trailers, interviews, and promotional loops, their faces moving through cycles of transformation. What could have felt mechanical instead felt poetic. The film's theme, learning through repetition, seemed to follow them into the world. Even in promotion, the story taught itself. The campaign's global expansion maintained this unity. In each market, the imagery adapted to local sensibilities but never lost rhythm. The tone of inevitability, the combination of exhaustion and triumph, translated across cultures. The team behind the awareness called it controlled universality. They understood that the film's concept, time as both enemy and teacher, needed no translation. Its emotion was universal. The strategy leaned into that truth, letting repetition become language. Financially, the campaign was a study in precision. Rather than scattering money across constant exposure, the studio concentrated its spend into synchronized moments, short bursts that replicated the film's cycle of action and pause. Every marketing push had a clear beginning, repetition, and resolution. The rhythm created memory far more effectively than volume could. The advertising spend itself became an artistic reflection of a narrative, deliberate, contained, powerful. The final phase of awareness came through human connection. The film's press strategy avoided hype-driven soundbites, focusing instead on process and endurance. The director and actors spoke about repetition, learning, failure, and refinement. Their sincerity aligned perfectly with the film's identity. Audiences didn't just hear promotion, they heard philosophy. That consistency between message and tone gave the campaign integrity. The public trusted what they saw because it felt honest. As opening week approached, the awareness reached its crescendo. Billboards glowed with the same repeated phrasing. Trailers played on loop in public spaces. Social media campaigns mimicked the structure of the story, short clips restarting mid-sequence, looping endlessly. The audience's engagement became reflexive. The marketing team observed a curious phenomenon: fatigue turning into fascination. The repetition no longer bored, it hypnotized. When the film finally premiered, it entered a world already primed to understand its rhythm. Viewers recognized the language of repetition not as gimmick, but as promise. The awareness campaign had done more than attract attention. It had conditioned perception. The public arrived already fluent in the film's design. They knew they would see patterns repeat, and they looked forward to their variations. Awareness had turned into education, marketing into preparation. After release, analysts described the campaign as one of coherence. Every piece, visual, verbal, emotional, had worked in concert. There had been no waste, no confusion, no dissonance. It was a study in how control can generate intrigue. The audience had felt guided, not manipulated. The awareness had achieved the rare balance between precision and warmth. In retrospect, the people behind it realized they had built something that mirrored the film's core theme: repetition not as redundancy, but as refinement. The awareness had evolved in the same way the protagonist evolved, through cycles of understanding. Each poster, each trailer, each word honed the message further until it reached perfect simplicity. Live, die, repeat. Those three words, once a tagline, became rhythm, philosophy, identity. When all the lights dimmed and the campaign closed, what lingered wasn't the noise of marketing, but the echo of tone. The awareness had not shouted. It had pulsed, steady as breath. It taught those who made it that attention is not taken. It is earned through rhythm, honesty, and trust in the intelligence of those watching. And in that rhythm, the film found not just its audience, but its permanence. The opening weekend arrived with a quiet certainty. The campaign had been deliberate and exact, the story familiar yet strange, and now all that precision waited to meet the unpredictable rhythm of audiences. For those who had built it, the first days felt like standing in the eye of a storm that had taken years to design. The atmosphere was not panic or celebration. It was observation. They had created something that lived in repetition, and now they watched to see if that repetition would echo in the world. The first screenings were charged with silence. The film began, looped, began again, and audiences leaned forward, intrigued by the pattern. The sound of recognition spread through theaters. Not laughter or gasps, but that collective exhale that comes when people understand something new but inevitable. The story's rhythm took hold. It pulled viewers into its pulse, and by the time the final loop ended, the audience had begun to understand what the production had lived through: mastery through endurance. Reports came in steadily, not explosively. Early numbers showed balance, not spectacle. The figures carried the same shape as the story itself: cycles of strength, brief dips, recoveries. Word of mouth spread like ripples, steady and credible. The people who had feared that repetition might confuse viewers realized that the opposite was true. The rhythm invited them in. Those who saw it once wanted to see it again, to notice what they had missed in the first cycle. The audience had begun living the film's metaphor without realizing it. In the studio offices, relief moved quietly through the corridors. There were no cheers, no announcements of triumph, just nods exchanged over spreadsheets. The pattern was clear. The film was holding. Analysts describe its opening as durable, a word that fit perfectly. It wasn't a storm, it was a tide. That steadiness mattered more than any early spike. It meant that people trusted what they had seen and were carrying it forward. For the cast and crew, the weekend felt reflective. They remembered the loops of filming, the exhaustion of resets, the physical strain that had defined their work. Now, as they read reactions, they felt a deep sense of recognition. Viewers spoke about fatigue turned to strength, about time used wisely, about persistence as evolution. Those were the same truths that had lived behind the camera. The art and the process had merged perfectly. The film was being understood exactly as it was made. Critics described the release with the language of rhythm: precise, patient, propulsive. Reviews focused less on spectacle and more on texture, the repetition that built empathy, the structure that transformed chaos into order. The marketing had prepared audiences for this tone, and now the response completed the circle. For the filmmakers, it was vindication not of success, but of method. Every choice, the control, the restraint, the loops, had landed. Financially, the first weekend followed the same pattern. There was no single day of explosion. Instead, there was stability, a rare quality in cinema's unpredictable rhythm. The studio saw it clearly in the data. Audiences were returning. Repeat viewings grew quietly, driven by curiosity rather than promotion. The film's design had created its own economic echo. The idea of repetition, once a creative risk, became financial endurance. The people behind it joked privately that they had invented a looping revenue curve. Within the first week, patterns in conversation emerged. People described the film as alive, as something that rewarded attention rather than consumption. That phrase began to appear everywhere, in interviews, on social media, in essays. The creators recognized it as the truest sign of success. The film was living outside itself, teaching its rhythm through experience. The audience had adopted its tempo. Each person who watched became part of its cycle of recognition. The team behind the release monitored this quiet expansion. Marketing did not shift strategy. It stayed patient, echoing the same calm confidence that had guided every other phase. New audiences arrived, not through saturation, but through word, through trust. The weekend numbers became a reflection of the film's identity, slow growth through consistency. Those who managed the accounts noticed how the film's trajectory defied volatility. It rose and held, mirroring the steady pulse of its own story. By Sunday evening, fatigue gave way to composure. The film had not failed, and it had not exploded. It had simply endured, and that was rarer. The creators spoke softly among themselves, recognizing that their work had been absorbed exactly as intended. They had made a story about persistence, and persistence had defined every stage of its journey. That symmetry carried a quiet beauty. In the following days, international numbers began to build, and the shape of success became clearer. The film had traveled the world through rhythm, not volume. It was understood everywhere because repetition speaks all languages. The audiences abroad reacted as those at home had: fascination, reflection, return. The financiers, reading reports, could see proof of what they had always hoped, that patience could travel as efficiently as spectacle. The film's emotional precision had translated into universal comprehension. As the week closed, the team gathered in calm acknowledgement. There was no need for declarations. The result spoke for itself. A release that moved like breath, an opening that sustained instead of spiked, a film that built its legacy through quiet resonance. The first weekend had become not an event, but a mirror, the world reflecting the discipline that had built it. Those who had lived the process understood that the release was not the conclusion, but another loop. The cycle of creation had passed into the cycle of reception. Each viewing renewed the meaning. Each conversation rewound the story. The film's rhythm continued in the lives of those who carried it. The people behind it could rest, knowing that the audience had joined the pattern. They had created something that endured by teaching endurance itself. When the last reports came in, steady and sure, the mood among the team was not triumph but balance. The film had held its line. No collapse, no chaos, no noise. The first weekend had proven that clarity could outlast hype, that rhythm could replace frenzy, that patience, once released into the world, returns multiplied. They had lived the loop, and now the loop belonged to everyone. After the noise of the first weekend quieted, the film entered the long corridor of its life. The slow, invisible phase when numbers stabilize, rights move, and revenue begins to echo across unseen distances. The excitement faded into administration, and the pulse of the film changed. It was no longer about attention. It was about continuation. The people who had guided it through creation now watched it shift into distribution, where momentum was measured not by applause but by clarity. In this stage, the rhythm of repetition returned, but softer. The process unfolded in patterns, statements, deductions, remittances, confirmations. The film had become data, yet each figure carried memory. Every sale represented a replay of trust, contracts honored, percentages recalculated, territories reconciled. It was strange how much humanity could live inside such structure. The film that once depicted cycles of time now lived through them in commerce, looping endlessly through systems built to turn effort into equilibrium. The first wave of distribution spread outward with precision. Digital platforms, satellite rights, physical releases, all synchronized like choreography. Each step required patience. The cycle of approvals, conversions, and audits moved slowly, yet it moved perfectly. The film's journey through markets resembled its story, controlled, recursive, deliberate. The producers no longer sought acceleration, they sought smoothness. They had learned that velocity without rhythm leads to imbalance. The film's afterlife had to breathe. Within the studio, departments worked in silence, transferring reports between hands. No one called these exchanges dramatic, but to those who understood their language, they were. Every update meant the system held. Every confirmation meant survival. The distributors spoke of flows rather than profits. They tracked the way value circulated, how the film moved through territories like wind, through corridors, invisible yet constant. Each deduction, each delay, each reconciliation was simply another loop closing. There were, as always, interruptions. A payment stalled, a licensing detail questioned, a statement needing correction. But these disruptions were brief and familiar. The people handling them had learned patience through the film itself. They treated each obstacle as iteration, not failure. The rhythm of the film's world, repeat until right, had become second nature. What would have once caused anxiety now felt procedural, another version of the same day, slightly improved. The distribution cycle revealed its own kind of beauty. Numbers moved like tides, gentle but inevitable. The initial theatrical surge slowed, replaced by the long hum of streaming performance, television rights, and later, archival value. The financial motion became cyclical and continuous. It mirrored the film's philosophy perfectly. Every end folds into a beginning. For those who monitored it, this pattern was satisfying. They were watching art function as a self-sustaining system. As months passed, the human element returned in unexpected ways. Reports carried comments, notes of gratitude, small reflections from international partners, acknowledgments of stability. These fragments, hidden among ledgers, reminded everyone that the system still contained people. The chain of hands that moved money also moved memory. The discipline of transparency had turned transaction into collaboration. Each successful reconciliation was a quiet conversation between trust and time. When deductions began to thin out and payments settled into rhythm, a calm recognition took hold. The producers realized that distribution is less about earning than maintaining. The preservation of tone through structure. The way a film moves through the world after release reveals its true design. This one moved cleanly without turbulence, carrying the same clarity it had on screen. Its financial path had become an extension of its aesthetic, order replacing chaos, control holding through repetition. Audiences, meanwhile, continued to discover it on their own cycles. The story's theme of reliving until mastery made the film endlessly rewatchable. Each new wave of viewers revived its presence in charts and discussions. These small resurgences created secondary loops of revenue. The film lived not as a singular event, but as a rhythm sustained over time. For the distributors, this was both financial and philosophical harmony. The market had adopted the film's pulse. As quarters closed and statements finalized, the producers saw the full map of its afterlife. The territories formed constellations, the revenues like orbiting satellites. Each line item told a small story, of risk transformed into stability, of patience rewarded by continuity. The film's distribution had become proof that clarity of process can mirror clarity of art. Everything that had defined its making, precision, rhythm, restraint, had translated perfectly into its financial life. By the time the final round of reconciliations arrived, the language of reports had softened. Terms like settled, cleared, and fulfilled appeared with comforting regularity. These words, once administrative, now felt emotional. They signified peace. The people who had carried the film's creation could finally see its journey reaching stillness. Every number aligned, every deduction accounted, every promise met. In the quiet that followed, Those closest to the film reflected on what this stage had revealed. They had discovered that distribution, like storytelling, is not about expansion but return. Everything moves outward only to come back in rhythm. The cycle completes itself, not through explosion, but through precision. The financial life of the film had repeated its creative lesson. Perfection isn't achieved by control over time, but by harmony with it. And so, in offices and inboxes where numbers replaced dialogue, the film continued to live, not loudly, not visibly, but in perfect motion. Each loop of payment and reconciliation was another echo of its heartbeat. The process would never truly end. It would only slow, refine, and return. Like its story, the film's distribution had found eternity not in scale, but in the repetition that turned effort into understanding. Time softened around the film once more. The loops of movement that had defined its creation, release, and distribution began to slow, leaving behind only those who waited. The participants, the believers, the ones who had carried it through every stage and now lived in its aftermath. They waited not with impatience, but with quiet endurance, knowing that in cinema, patience is a form of participation. The film's systems were still at work, invisible and consistent, settling accounts and closing circuits. For the people attached to it, this final phase was less about expectation than about faith in rhythm. The financiers waited first, their anticipation measured but calm. They had placed trust in cycles, in process, in the understanding that the world of cinema rarely moves quickly, but always moves deliberately. The early reports had promised stability. Now they sought closure. Each statement that arrived brought a small echo of reassurance. Percentages cleared, shares calculated, all moving in the same steady pulse. They could see the shape of their investment now, not as profit alone, but as proof that discipline endures. The waiting no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned. For the producers, waiting carried another kind of gravity. They had lived inside the film structure for years, bending time to keep it whole. Now, with everything complete, they found themselves without rhythm. The meetings grew fewer, the inbox quieter, the calendar blank. Their waiting was reflective rather than expectant. They watched the film's long tail of performance, the slow, recurring life of viewings, streams, and revivals, and they recognized themselves in it. The film kept reliving its moment, and they, too, were caught in that cycle, waiting not for money but for release from its hold. For the artists, the actors, editors, and craftspeople, the waiting was emotional. Payment was not what they anticipated, though some still tracked it with cautious hope. Their patience was rooted in memory. They waited to feel distance from the exhaustion that had shaped them, to see the film exist without their names attached. Every update about performance or rights brought mixed feelings. Gratitude, nostalgia, melancholy. They realized that the film had taken a part of their rhythm and was still living it elsewhere, quietly looping through strangers' screens and thoughts. There were also the quieter participants, the coordinators, consultants, assistants, those who had worked in shadowed rooms, ensuring that the machinery of production ran smoothly. For them, waiting meant closure of a different kind. They looked for acknowledgments, for confirmations that their work had mattered. The small gestures, a message of thanks, a note on a statement, meant more than any number. Their patience was intimate. They waited for recognition, not reward. Every film's life eventually slows to paperwork, and even that carries human weight. The accountants and administrators who guided its circulation treated the remaining tasks with the same precision as the beginning. They waited for final signatures, reconciliations, the quiet sound of a loop closing. Each completed form marked the fading of motion. Waiting became their final duty, the act that sealed everything. As months passed, waiting transformed into reflection. The participants began to realize that this stillness was not an end, but a continuation, the echo of movement that persists after sound stops. They thought about the loops of creation and release, about how each stage had taught endurance. Now the lesson was patience. Time would continue to turn their work into memory, their memory into legacy. The waiting they saw was not passive. It was transformation in slow motion. The film itself still moved silently. Streams, broadcasts, rentals, small flows of attention circling the globe. Each one carried residual energy, a signal that the story was still alive somewhere. Those who waited could sense it, even without seeing it. Their patience was rewarded in traces, a message from a viewer, a new review, a foreign release notice. These fragments arrived like whispers from the loop, reminders that the work they had made was still teaching people how to endure. Among the financiers, relief began to surface first. The numbers aligned. The risk had become return. Their waiting ended with confirmation, stability. They looked at the outcome and saw not windfall but balance. For them, patience had proven its worth. They learned again the lesson that time is the only true currency in art. The film had paid back more than money. It had paid back order. The producers' waiting ended differently. It faded into quiet nostalgia. When the final reconciliations arrived, they read them like letters from past life. The documents were clean, exact, unambiguous. Nothing was left unresolved. They closed their laptops and felt the peculiar calm that follows long struggle, the silence of something that no longer requires them. They had learned that the hardest part of creation is not control, but release. For the artists, the waiting dissolved into distance. They saw their film appear in retrospectives, streaming menus, discussions of overlooked gems. The world was catching up in its own time. Their patience became vindication. What once felt like exhaustion had turned into evidence of endurance. They had waited long enough to see their work understood. And yet, even as closures arrived, no one felt entirely detached. The film's theme had been repetition, and its life continued to mirror that. Royalties, messages, memories, small loops of return that reminded everyone that endings are illusions. The waiting would never truly end. It would only change form. Each new audience member began the cycle again. Each rediscovery reopened the rhythm. In this final phase, patience itself became art. The participants no longer waited for outcomes. They waited with understanding. They had learned to let the film live at its own tempo, to let the loop continue without interference. What they felt now was not anticipation but gratitude, the kind that grows when time has proven something true. The last reports came quietly, final notes in a long piece of music. All accounts reconciled, all obligations fulfilled. Those who had once lived through motion now sat in stillness, aware that the film's pulse would continue elsewhere. The waiting had turned into watching, the effort into peace. In the end, they realized that the act of patience had completed the circle. The film had taught them its final lesson, not through its story, but through its life. That waiting is not absence, but continuation. That endings are repetitions waiting to be seen differently. And in that stillness, they found what every creation eventually seeks, the calm knowledge that what they made will keep moving long after they've stopped watching. Relief did not arrive like a rush of triumph. It came as still air, a sense of completion that filled rooms once defined by motion. The film's long journey, through creation, release, distribution, and waiting, had finally reached its balance. The people who had carried it through each loop began to feel their muscles unclench, their minds empty, their days stretch without urgency. There was nothing left to pursue, nothing left to adjust. The film existed now on its own rhythm, repeating quietly across screens around the world, self-sustaining. The relief was not celebration. It was silence made whole. The first to feel it were those who had managed its pulse from the start. Producers, financiers, coordinators, they had lived in constant motion, their days ruled by numbers, schedules, and expectation. Now the messages that arrived were simple, reconciled, completed, archived. The words looked mechanical but sounded like peace. They no longer waited for updates, no longer counted intervals between reports. The structure had held, the system had worked. The relief they felt was not about success, but about the absence of failure, the calm of closure that never announced itself, but settled quietly over everything. The cast and crew experienced it differently. Their relief was emotional, layered with fatigue and memory. They had carried the repetition in their bodies, in muscles that had learned to perform exhaustion on cue. Now that the work was done, they found that stillness carried its own strangeness. The energy that had once filled every day of shooting had no outlet. Some felt hollow at first, others restless. But slowly, that emptiness transformed into perspective. They began to see what they had made from a distance and realized that the effort had not dissolved. It had crystallized into permanence. The film had taken their labor and turned it into rhythm, one that would now play without them. The financier's relief was quieter still, almost meditative. They had tracked each phase of uncertainty, production delays, marketing cycles, release patterns, and now every number aligned. There were no anomalies, no lingering concerns. What remained was proportionality. Faith invested, faith returned. The calm they felt came from understanding that stability is the highest form of profit. The money had done what it needed to do, enable clarity, and clarity had outlasted it. For the smaller participants, the workers who built, carried, and coordinated, the relief arrived in practical ways. Final payments processed, final acknowledgments received, names listed correctly in the credits. There was satisfaction in these closures, small but genuine. The machinery of cinema often forgets those who make it run, but this project had remembered them. The discipline that had defined the film extended into its ending, ensuring that everyone's contribution reached completion. For them, relief came not from grandeur, but from recognition. There was a universal stillness in the months that followed. The chatter around the film subsided into analysis, retrospectives, quiet admiration. It had found its place, respected, understood, revisited in cycles. The creators, now outside of its orbit, felt a strange comfort in that distance. The film no longer belonged to them, but it still carried their intent. The idea that they had built something capable of surviving without their control was its own form of relief. Control had given way to trust, and trust had proven itself enough. In the offices where its accounts were finally closed, people noticed the atmosphere shift. The spreadsheets that once dictated motion were now static. The budgets had become history. The names on them, once points of stress, became reminders of endurance. The administrators who had spent years tracking the film's movement paused over their last signatures. They had guided it through chaos and repetition, through the delicate architecture of patience. And now, with everything settled, they felt the odd lightness of conclusion. They had worked inside its loops and finally stepped out of them. The creative team's relief was gentler, shaped by reflection. They saw that the film had not changed the world, but it had changed them. Its repetition had taught them discipline. Its precision had taught them empathy. They realized that what they had built on screen, a world where time resets until understanding is earned, had mirrored their own lives for years. Every setback, every adjustment, every delay had been a rehearsal for grace. Now, as they stood outside that cycle, they carried the rhythm of its patience into their own days. The relief they felt was not release from the film, but reunion with themselves. Over time, that relief deepened into clarity. The people who had once worked in noise began to appreciate quiet. They recognized that closure in cinema is never abrupt. It is gradual, like dawn. The film's lingering success, its steady audience, its continued resonance, became proof that calm can last longer than spectacle. For the financiers, this permanence justified restraint. For the artists, it justified honesty. For the technicians, it justified precision. Everyone found, in their own way, that peace had been the project's final goal all along. The relief also carried humility. The team understood that no film ends cleanly, only gracefully. There would always be echoes, royalties, screenings, rediscoveries, but those were no longer theirs to manage. The loops would continue without them. Their job had been to complete this cycle once, fully, faithfully, and they had. What remained was the faint vibration of effort turned into art, of chaos turned into balance. The relief came from knowing they had left nothing undone. In the years that followed, The film's name appeared again and again in unexpected places: discussions about narrative rhythm, studies of structure, essays on patience. Each reappearance was like a quiet wave returning to shore. The people who had made it would sometimes see these mentions and smile, not out of pride but recognition. The film was still living through its loops, still teaching its calm lessons. Their relief was renewed each time, proof that peace can echo. Ultimately, what they carried away from the experience was not exhaustion or triumph, but comprehension. They understood that art and process had fused, that repetition had been the teacher, and that relief is what remains when mastery meets acceptance. The final ledger, the last screening, the closing of accounts, all became one motion, an exhale. The work had been done, and it had lasted. And so, in the end, the relief became indistinguishable from gratitude. The people who had lived inside the loop now lived outside it, but the rhythm stayed with them. The film had ended, but its patience endured. Its creation had taught them something simple and vast: that peace is not what follows effort, but what effort becomes when everything aligns. That was the final loop, and the only one that truly stayed unbroken. When the dust of completion finally settled and the rhythm of repetition faded into distance, what remained was understanding. The film had completed its cycle, from idea to creation, from release to return, and left behind not just memory, but clarity. Everyone who had touched it, from financiers to artists to the smallest hands behind the machinery, carried lessons etched by endurance. They no longer spoke about results or numbers. They spoke about patterns, about what time and patience had revealed. The film had begun as fiction about persistence, but in its making and its life, it had become a study in truth. The first and clearest lesson was that discipline is the only real freedom in art. Every person who worked on it had experienced how control, once mastered, allows for creation without fear. The loops of the story had mirrored the loops of the production, the constant returning, redoing, refining. What first felt like confinement had become revelation. Repetition, they realized, was not punishment but purification. The more they returned to the same place, the clearer their purpose became. The exhaustion had turned into method. This lesson stayed with them. Mastery is not movement, but alignment. The second lesson was about trust, the invisible current beneath everything. The film had demanded belief that systems would hold, that time would reward patience, that chaos would bend toward order. Those who financed it learned to measure success not in surges but in steadiness. Those who made it learned to surrender control without losing clarity. The collaboration between creation and management, between vision and number, became proof that art only survives when faith is distributed equally. Trust had not been spoken about much during production, but in retrospect, they all agreed it had been the foundation. They also learned that fatigue is not the enemy of art. It is its mirror. The film's physical and emotional strain had produced authenticity. The exhaustion of the cast became the exhaustion of the characters. The persistence of the crew became the texture of the world. Fatigue, when carried with intention, transforms into sincerity. The film's realism was not performance. It was lived. The people who had made it now understood that weariness and meaning are often the same thing, viewed from different sides of completion. Communication, too, had become a quiet teacher. Every misunderstanding, every delay, every moment of friction had shown them that words can lose clarity under pressure. The process forced them to speak less and mean more. By the end, there was a shared fluency between departments, an economy of language born from necessity. The film taught them how to listen as carefully as they planned. They began to see that the true craft of collaboration is not speaking in order, but listening in rhythm. The producers, who had lived longest in its orbit, found that patience had been their greatest instrument. They had learned that leadership is not instruction, but composure, the ability to remain still while others move, to absorb pressure instead of amplifying it. They realized that the calm they held through chaos had defined the film's tone more than any creative choice. That composure became their inheritance, something they carried into every project afterward. The financiers looked back and saw a different kind of wisdom. The financiers looked back and saw a different kind of wisdom. The film had proven that calculated restraint yields longevity. The markets had shifted since its release, the models had changed, but the pattern of return, the slow, consistent hum of continued relevance, remained. They now viewed endurance as profit. They understood that patience, properly managed, multiplies itself. The lesson was not about money, it was about rhythm. For the artists, the lessons were personal. They realized that repetition, rather than draining creativity, refines it. The constant retakes, the revisited scenes, the mirrored emotions, all had trained them to find nuance where others might see monotony. They discovered that truth lives inside precision. Every time they relived a moment, it revealed something new. This understanding followed them into their later work. Repetition became a tool, not a trial. The crew, who had built and rebuilt the world every day, found their own meaning in resilience. They learned that perfection is not a single act, but a sustained balance between motion and repair. Every setup, every teardown, every readjustment was a small act of faith that the structure would hold. That lesson transcended cinema. They carried it into life. The knowledge that work done quietly and consistently endures longer than any spectacle. When they gathered years later, long after the film circuits had cooled, the tone among them was neither nostalgia nor pride. It was calm recognition. They spoke about how the film had slowed them down, how it had taught them to look at time differently. They talked about how they no longer rushed decisions, how they trusted stillness. The film had trained them to see time not as a resource to be spent, but as a collaborator to be heard. The pattern of reflection extended to the smallest participants too. Assistants, interns, drivers, and coordinators all spoke of how the film had changed their understanding of labor. They had seen how patience and detail shapes greatness, how small actions sustain larger ones. For them, the film had turned routine into ritual. It had shown that precision at any level contributes to the harmony of the whole. In all these recollections, a single truth kept resurfacing. The process was the story. The repetition, the waiting, the patience, the relief, it had all been one lesson told through different forms. The film had started as fiction about time, but in its making, it had become non-fiction about endurance. Every department, every decision, every loop had embodied the same principle, that understanding is earned through rhythm, not speed. By the time the final reflections were shared and the last messages exchanged, the lesson had solidified into something lasting. That art and its making are not opposites but mirrors. To create something enduring, one must live through its rhythm fully, through frustration, through silence, through patience, through grace. The film had done that. It had repeated itself until truth appeared. And so, years later, the people who once called it work now called it inheritance. They carried forward the quiet certainty that nothing meaningful is built once. It is built again and again until it becomes inevitable. They had learned that repetition is not a flaw in progress, but the heartbeat of mastery. The film had taught them how to endure, how to listen, how to wait, and finally, how to let go. That was the final understanding. That endings are not closures but confirmations, that something made with balance, patience, and truth never truly stops. It simply finds new rhythms in other hands, new loops in other times. And somewhere, always, the same pulse continues, steady, human, and whole.